Recording in progress.
We are live, Your Honor.
Meeting of the City Council and the Planning Commission will please come to order. Would you all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let the record show that all council members and planning commissioners are present, with the exception of council members Collazo and Freitas. It was my understanding that they'll not be attending this evening due to real property that they each own within proximity of a number of housing sites identified within the housing element. And I believe that Planning Commissioner Aguilar is likewise not feeling well tonight.
He is actually with us on Zoom, Your Honor.
Oh, he's on Zoom? Oh, okay, great. Okay. So item B is city manager reports. Staff report, please, Mr. Benoon.
Yes, good evening, Your Honor, members of the council, members of the Planning Commission. If you may recall, last fall, we held a joint work session, received a presentation from Mr. Paul Penninger, the Baird and Driscoll Community Planning Group. During that presentation, Mr. Penninger explained changes to state law that govern our housing element. And he also provided an explanation of general concepts related to housing elements. Tonight, we will receive another presentation from Mr. Penninger. During this presentation, he will provide more detail as to how specific housing sites can be selected, including all the policy considerations related thereto, provide an update on recent community engagement surveys, and also solicit feedback and direction from the council and commission as to some specific policy considerations. Our community development director, Mr. Stephen Turner, is also here with us this evening. He will be assisting Mr. Penninger with the presentation. I'd also like to point out that Mr. Turner was instrumental in the community engagement process, and I thank him for his tremendous efforts in engaging our community. Before I pass it over to Mr. Penninger, a little bit about him. He is a recognized housing expert who has assisted many public agencies in developing housing programs. He's a proud graduate of UC Santa Cruz as well as UC Berkeley, where he currently teaches land economics for coursework and master's programs. With that in mind, Mr. Penninger, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Okay, thank you for the very kind introduction. Mr. Mayor, members of the Council and Planning Commission, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you about the housing element update and specifically about our preliminary analysis of potential sites that can be included in the general plan housing element for the city of Newark. We're going to talk about the overview of the housing element, what it is, where we are in the update process, bring you up to date on our community engagement process to date, and specifically on some preliminary results from the online community survey, which we conducted. Then we'll talk about housing sites generally by sub-area of the city. I'll walk you through some major policy considerations, which are new for this housing element update round, that really didn't apply in previous housing element update rounds that make the analysis of sites a bit more complicated and intricate. And then, most importantly, we'll have time for a discussion and for us to receive your feedback on sites and related policies and programs that should be included in the housing element. As we've discussed before, the housing element is one of the required parts of every California jurisdiction's general plan, along with the land use element, circulation element, etc. It needs to be updated on a regular cycle. For most cities, that cycle is every 8 years. And in the Bay Area region, we're in the midst of what we call the 6th housing element cycle update, which will cover the planning period between January 2023 and January 2031. The housing element, in addition to being reviewed and adopted by local government bodies, the city council, or in the case of the county, a board of supervisors, needs to be certified by the state housing and community development department as being in compliance with state law. And in order to meet the statutorily imposed deadline, jurisdictions in California in the Bay Area need to have their housing elements adopted and reviewed and certified by the end of January 2023. So every Every single jurisdiction in the Bay Area is currently updating the housing element of the general plan, and so the city of Newark is not alone. All of your neighboring jurisdictions are also doing the same process. The planning target, the number of housing units that jurisdictions are planning towards, is something called RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. This is a figure that's handed down to the region by the State Housing and Community Development Department, by HCD, and then the region, through a methodology process, suballocates that regional housing target to individual jurisdictions. Now, as you can see on this slide, the increase between this planning round and the last planning round was significant for most jurisdictions. In Newark, the planning target for the sixth cycle RHNA is 1,874 total units. That's the number of units that the city is being asked to plan towards accommodating during the planning period. And that represents a 73.8% increase over the RHNA 5 planning period cycle. Your neighboring jurisdictions of Union City and Fremont had even larger increases in their RHNA allocations, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. And you can see region-wide, the total number of housing units that all of the 9-county Bay Area region cities and counties are meant to plan for is 441,176 total housing units to accommodate housing need during the planning period. So that's a 134% increase over the previous RHNA 5 planning cycle. So jurisdictions across the region, and certainly in Newark, are looking for new and creative ways to plan for meeting housing needs in the future. The RHNA number is broken down by category of income level, or area median income level, and this is to make sure that as jurisdictions are planning to meet overall housing needs, they're specifically putting in place policies that will facilitate the production of housing or the preservation of housing to meet needs of households at all income levels, including very low-income households, low-income households, and moderate-income households. You can see from this slide that in Newark, the percentage of very low and low-income units that you're being asked to plan for is somewhat less than in Alameda County overall. And I'll show you on the next slide why that is. It has to do with the methodology that the ABAG convened RHNA Methodology Committee landed on to allocate the RHNA housing units across jurisdictions. And in the final methodology, there were a few factors that were emphasized that affected how the overall RHNA allocation was allocated, and then also the specific distribution of income levels. So the final RHNA methodology emphasized planning for housing in high opportunity areas, meaning areas with lots of jobs, good services, and relatively high incomes. Also in areas that were considered job rich, so employment rich areas. And then finally in areas with strong job transit proximity, so areas with access to heavy or light rail services or with high frequency bus rapid transit services would also then receive a relatively larger increase in their RHNA and possibly a higher distribution of very low and low income households. Finally, there was an equity adjustment that was added onto the methodology at the end of the methodology process to ensure an equitable distribution of lower income housing across the region, which meant that if you're a jurisdiction that had an area median income level that was somewhat lower than your neighboring jurisdictions, you might also receive a lower overall RHNA and a lower allocation of very low and low income households. So kind of a complicated methodology that ABAG, MTC, the regional agency, came up with to allocate the RHNA. It's now finalized, and that's why you have the planning target that you have of 1874 broken down by the different AMI levels. To give you an update on where we are in the housing element update process, we've been working on this since, well, the end of last year, and then working very intensively through early to mid-spring to the present on community engagement, on the needs assessment, on reviewing and updating the city's policies and programs, and on identifying a preliminary set of potential housing element sites. Our intention is to have a public review draft of the housing element complete by the end of June, and with the objective of presenting the City Council and Planning Commission with final draft housing elements in the fall of this year for adoption and then presentation to HCD. This slide shows where we are on each of the major components of the housing element. And I want to say about community engagement that, and this is something that HCD and state law emphasize very heavily, that community engagement isn't just something that occurs and then stops. HCD wants to see continuous community engagement and public participation throughout the housing element update process, and clear evidence that policymakers, planners, and elected officials and appointed officials are taking comments that are received from the public seriously in the way that they're setting policy. So this is a new and more robust kind of approach to community engagement that HCD is taking. And that's something that also we know is very important to the city of Newark. So we're going to continue to do ongoing community engagement throughout the year as we work on drafts of the housing element and continue to refine our work and our approach. We're also working on a needs assessment, which is a required part of the housing element that includes a lot of data from the census and also local sources of data to identify key housing needs. As I mentioned, we're reviewing the previous housing element to see what worked and maybe some things that could be improved. We're looking at housing constraints, both non-governmental and governmental constraints to housing production. And we've identified a preliminary list of housing element sites or housing sites that would be good to accommodate housing. Once we're done with all of those things, we can begin to talk about any rezoning needs, if there are any, and then begin to flesh out any additional programs, policies, and related quantified objectives that would be needed for the housing element. So moving on to community engagement, we have to date done several things. We've stood up a website that's specific to the housing element, and it's at newarkhousingupdate.org. We've gotten a lot of community participation and input through the housing element website, and we've recently completed an online community survey. It came to a close on April 30th. In total, we received 342 responses to the survey. The vast majority were in English, 38 were in Spanish, and 4 were in Chinese. We haven't completed compiling all of the results from the survey. We will do that in the next week or so and have a draft report that will be available. I would like to say that even though we didn't receive that many responses from non-English speakers, a lot of the people who chose to fill out the survey in English did indicate that along with English, they had another household language that they spoke at home. So it's not to say that the English language surveys were all completed by folks who are monolingual English speakers. So we're going to do a full demographic write-up of all of the responses that we received. And I think, you know, we made a real effort to go out to the community and go to the public library and the family day in the park and do outreach to encourage people to fill out the survey and get them engaged. And I think we're generally pretty pleased with the response that we got from the community. We're also on an ongoing basis meeting with stakeholders and key community groups, and also particular groups that are identified in the housing element law as being particularly significant. So there are certain special needs populations that we're meant to reach out to. For example, farm workers, people who are homeless or at risk of being homeless, large families, single-parent households, people with mental or physical disabilities, and other special needs populations. So we're continuing to undertake that kind of community engagement that's relatively focused, and we'll connect that to the policies and programs that are presented to you in the draft housing element. So a few preliminary points of feedback from the community engagement survey, and I apologize that this is difficult to see on the side. One of the key questions we asked is, how concerned are you about the availability of affordable housing in Newark? And 53.4% of the people who filled out the survey said very concerned, and another 22.3% said somewhat concerned. Only 12% said not that concerned, and another 10% or so said not at all concerned. So 75% of the Newark population, to the extent that this is representative of the overall Newark population, are concerned about affordable housing, think of it as a key issue. Within that, we asked folks to identify some major issues to address, and several things kind of rose to the top. More home ownership opportunities, especially for first-time homeowners, more rental housing opportunities, especially for key workers, single parents, and housing for those with barriers to housing, like veterans and people with disabilities. And then finally, beyond just creating new housing units, programs for things like low-cost home improvement programs for seniors and those on limited incomes. So how can we help folks stay in their homes and improve their homes and make their homes more livable? Another common theme across a lot of the feedback that we got was that not all residents feel that they live in neighborhoods that are high opportunity neighborhoods. And specifically, residents, along with commenting on housing, commented on things that they would like to see in their neighborhoods. These included items like improved infrastructure for sidewalks, bike lanes, roads, parks, obviously safe, affordable, and healthy housing options, and then finally, quality of educational opportunities. So schools came up a lot in the survey, and particularly when we were asking people about family housing, we got comments about the need for educational opportunities that are academically and culturally supportive. We also asked, very importantly for this discussion this afternoon, where should new housing go? And the top responses were New Park Place specific plan area, followed by Old Town, Bayside Newark, and then other. And you can see from this bar graph that a little over 35% of residents identified New Park Place as a good place for housing, for new housing to go, and a little over 30% identified Old Town, the Old Town area, as a good place for housing to go. Some other places that we didn't call out specifically in the survey, but that folks mentioned in their comments, were the Four Corners area. And then very significantly, anywhere and everywhere for housing that's affordable for families and single parents. That's a direct quote from the survey. Several people in the open comments also mentioned that the schools could be a potential location for future housing, considering that there may or may not be some consolidation of schools in the future in the Newark Public Schools. So that leads us into talking about building the city's sites inventory, where housing should go, how you actually plan to meet this target of planning for 1,874 units over the planning period. And I'm going to go through each component of the housing elements sites inventory very quickly, and we can talk about them in depth if you have questions. The way that you build the sites inventory is first to look at units in the planning pipeline. These are projects that are already in the pipeline that the city has received applications for or that are otherwise known about. You can then count the future development of accessory dwelling units. This is based on past production of accessory dwelling units, so ADUs are an increasingly important way for households to add housing and in some cases generate income, so they could be an economic development strategy as well for certain households. Conversion or preservation of existing housing, so if you have affordable housing in your community that's at risk of losing its affordability covenants, you can identify those and enact policies to preserve affordable housing. That we've been able to identify, there are no preservation opportunities in Newark that we know of, but we're still looking for those opportunities. And then finally, and most importantly, the biggest chunk of your sites inventory will come from vacant and non-vacant sites. These are sites that aren't in the planning pipeline, that are just sites that could potentially be developed with housing during the planning period, whether or not they're vacant residential land or whether more commonly they have some other use that could be redeveloped with housing over time. A key point to note is that HCD has a rule of thumb that if sites are zoned to accommodate projects at 30 dwelling units to the acre or higher, that they're automatically considered to be suitable for lower income housing. And the reason for this is that at that density, it's more feasible for developers of affordable housing to make their projects financially viable. So if you're a nonprofit housing developer and you're trying to get low-income housing tax credits or other sources of financing to build housing, you need a certain scale of development to make your project economics work. And so the specific target that HCD has identified for Alameda County jurisdictions is 30 dwelling units to the acre. That's for every Alameda County city over 25,000 people. And this is just a rule of thumb. These are also called the Mullen densities. You don't have to use this to identify opportunities for lower income housing, but it is a way for you to take a quick pass at your sites and figure out, all of your sites that have this characteristic could potentially accommodate lower income housing during the planning period. So a little bit more about types of sites. We talked about planned and proposed projects. These are projects for which the city has received preliminary or full applications. Any project that receives a COO, a certificate of occupancy, after June 30th of 2022 would be in this category. Vacant and underutilized sites include sites primarily in the Newark Park Place specific plan, Dumbarton TOD, and Old Town specific plan areas, but there may be many others that we can identify. And then, as I mentioned, in order to identify sites to accommodate lower income RHNA, you can use these default densities or Mullen densities as a back of the envelope way of identifying those sites. This is a very preliminary tabulation of all of the potential development opportunities in Newark, taking into account your planned and proposed projects, vacant and non-vacant sites, and accessory dwelling unit production. And what we've done here is we've also added a buffer. And the reason for adding this buffer, this 20% buffer, is a state law which says that jurisdictions need to replace any sites that are identified for low-income housing that have been developed with market rate housing during the planning period with another suitable site. So let me say that another way. If you've identified a site for affordable housing, and then a couple years after you adopt the housing element, a market rate developer comes along and acquires the site and develops 100% market rate units, then you've lost that site for affordable housing. So what the law says is that you now have to then go back and identify another site for affordable housing to replace it. So that's why we add in this buffer to give you some additional room should you need to go back and identify more sites for affordable housing on top of those that you've already identified to meet your 1874 target. As you can see from this preliminary summary, and we're still working on this, so I'm not going to linger long on this slide. It does appear at the outset that you have sufficient sites to meet your RHNA for each income category, including factoring in a 20% buffer. So I would say that at this point in the analysis, you're in relatively good shape, particularly vis-a-vis many other jurisdictions in Alameda County. These are some of the areas, we've already talked about them, where we've begun to identify specific sites. And in the final analysis, we will have detailed maps that will identify the sites by parcel number, by general plan land use designation, by zoning, and by many other characteristics, including an analysis of realistic capacity to develop, and also any constraints, infrastructure, environmental, or otherwise, that might impede development. But as you can see from this first map, and this is a large percentage of the units that we're anticipating will be developed over the next planning period, the New Park Place specific plan area would accommodate quite a few sites. Also, the Old Town specific plan area. Now, this is obviously there's not as many large parcels, but there are a number of smaller parcels that could be assembled by developers, possibly in partnership with the city or with the support of the city. And the Old Town specific plan already includes policies and programs to facilitate residential development in key locations. And then finally, the Dumbarton TOD specific plan area is another area where we've identified quite a few sites that could accommodate housing during the planning period. A few new planning and policy considerations for you to consider when you're thinking about where housing should go. HCD, under recent state law, is looking for more detailed analysis of realistic capacity. So, for example, if more than one use is allowed on a site, so say, for example, under the planning code, a developer could develop a retail site or a retail project or an office development on a site. HCD doesn't want to assume that 100% of the site is going to accommodate housing. They want us to go the extra mile of doing very specific analysis to figure out if housing is actually feasible and what the realistic capacity is for housing to be developed on that site. If you're primarily relying on underutilized sites to accommodate your lower income RHNA, that means your lower income RHNA means your very low and low income household planning targets. You need to assume that the existing uses will impede residential development and require substantial evidence of the discontinuation of the existing uses. That means things like a letter from the property owner or the developer saying that they're going to do something different with the property than what's currently on it, right? So it's not enough just to sort of point at a site and say it's underutilized, it could be housing. You need to go the extra mile and really show that there's potential for housing to go there. Also, if you're identifying sites that you've previously identified in either the 4th or 5th cycle housing element updates, and you want to reuse those sites, you need to make them developable by right. And what that means is that they would be subject to ministerial review or staff review, and not any kind of conditional or discretionary review process. It's important to note within that design review is acceptable, particularly if you have objective design standards that you can apply to sites. Jurisdictions are allowed to review the design of housing that's proposed on these sites from previous housing element planning periods. But if you want to reuse them, you need to put in place new zoning that makes them developable by right. Another new element, new part of this housing element update is that if the housing element is found to be in compliance with state law by the end of January 2023, then you have 3 years for rezoning of any sites if any rezoning is needed, and it may or may not be, and then any related CEQA review. If you're not found in compliance by the end of January 2023, then you have 1 year to complete that rezoning. And then finally, and very importantly, throughout the housing element, and this is the through line through all of the housing element sections, there's added attention this year to affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this is per a law that was passed called AB 686, which requires jurisdictions to look at ways to affirmatively further fair housing throughout their housing plan update, and focused on 4 major issue areas: racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, integration and segregation patterns, disparities in access to opportunity, and then disproportionate housing needs experienced by different special needs populations. So we're taking all of these issue areas and all of these factors into account in everything that we're doing in every part of the housing element per state law, and also because it's a planning and policy priority for the housing element, and it's something that you will definitely see in the draft programs and policies that are presented to you. So that said, we have a few key questions that we'd love to hear your feedback on. And obviously, any other points of discussion or questions that you have are very welcome as well. Very importantly, are there key sites and or areas of the city that we haven't included in this preliminary analysis that should be considered? Some of the comments we got from the community engagement survey mentioned the Four Corners area. Are there other areas of the city that we should be looking at? Are there other sites that we should be looking at beyond Dumbarton, TOD, New Park Place, and Old Town? Where should housing go? Considering AFFH requirements, are the sites that we've identified in the maps that we showed you are well distributed throughout the community to equitably meet future housing needs? And how should we meaningfully integrate concerns around affirmatively furthering fair housing in the site's selection process? And then finally, are there areas of the city with environmental and infrastructure constraints that should not include future housing development? Where should housing not go? Housing obviously can't go everywhere. The city has other priorities. There are also sometimes environmental or infrastructure constraints that make it unlikely that housing would be feasible. So the type of feedback that we're looking for this afternoon from you is, are we on the right track? Have we left any important sites out? And are there any other considerations that we should be taking into account as we move on to the next steps? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Penninger. And why don't we start with asking if anybody's in the audience who would like to speak on this item. Anybody in the audience like to speak on this? No? Okay. Then City Clerk Harrington, are there any requests to speak online?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Okay, so then that brings us to council comments, and I think I'll just start off with a couple of questions. One, you had noted that sidewalks was a major concern with some people, and I've been under the impression that Newark probably has the least amount of area that don't have sidewalks than many other communities. So I guess I don't understand that particular thing. And then the other thing was in your application of showing the different areas where housing could go, you did not include any of the school sites which have been closed. And I think there was perhaps some reason for that. So that's my questions. I don't know if you want to answer those, or you want to get all the questions first from the council, or?
I think we can take them one at a time. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I don't know where the sidewalks comment came from. I've certainly not observed a problem with sidewalks in Newark. People had, and I think in some cases people may even be observing parts of the unincorporated county that are near Newark. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I think it was part of a broader set of comments around community amenities that we got from folks, and this is maybe more important, that it's not just about the housing, it's about everything else as well. It's about schools, it's about parks, it's about, the overall context of creating a vibrant place and a vibrant community. So we can take the sidewalks comment out.
Okay.
On the second question, so we're glad to add in that, so let me step back a little bit. Public sites that are owned by public agencies, whether they're school districts or utility districts or cities or counties, are great opportunities for building affordable housing. And that's a strategy that's been used successfully by a lot of cities in California. And I think it's something that is a really great potential strategy for Newark. In order for those sites to be viable, they need to have a general plan land use designation, they need to have zoning, and they need to have supportive policies and programs to make them viable during the planning period. There also needs to be the willing participation and active engagement of the school district or whatever the other public agency is in order to make that viable. So I would love to include some publicly owned parcels or sites because I think it's such a great strategy. It's a way, as we know, land costs are one of the biggest obstacles, constraints to housing development in the Bay Area right now. So leveraging publicly owned parcels of land to create affordable housing is a great strategy. But we have some more work to do to make that a viable strategy for the school district sites.
Okay.
But thank you for that direction. We'll follow up on that.
Okay, good. Other questions from the council? Vice Mayor Hannon.
Paul, thank you for the report. Thank you for the report. Detailed as always. Appreciate that. Just a couple of quick questions. When you talk about access to opportunities, what the mayor discussed in terms of improved roads and sidewalks and things of that nature, I know this was a survey that was completed online. It might be helpful if you didn't include that to ask the citizen to provide additional information regarding public infrastructure improvements that they would like to see in their neighborhood. That way, at least we're aware of it and can address it if need be down the road. As you do community engagement, just a thought, maybe reach out to the local grammar schools and the high schools. They typically have parent-teacher meetings and things of that nature. It might be an opportunity to engage that audience. I'm pleased to see that you're using multiple languages. You know, we have a very diverse community here in Newark, so the more we do in terms of reaching out to those that English is not their primary language is greatly appreciated. I thank you for that. I'm not surprised to see that these survey questions showed, in essence, 75% of our residents identified affordable housing as a need in this community. And that's where I was somewhat surprised, Paul, in terms of our RENA allocation, that 65% of our allocation was really for moderate and high moderate income groups. I would have thought, because the goal, it seems to me, in the Bay Area is to build more affordable housing, it seems like the goals for many Bay Area cities would have been to have a higher affordable housing goal. Could you discuss briefly why why that's not the case?
Well, first of all, I think that's an admirable approach to thinking about RENA. Many jurisdictions have had the sort of opposite take, which was that they had too many affordable housing units to plan for. They would have argued that the methodology had tended to ask them to plan for more housing to accommodate very low or lower income housing than they were really capable of. It has to do with the cities that you're located next to, and also your area median income compared to the area median income in surrounding jurisdictions. So what the equity adjustment did at the end of the RENA methodology process, as I understand it, is that it said that if you're a higher income neighborhood or jurisdiction, you're going to receive more very low or lower income housing to plan for. Also, at the outset, transit was weighed relatively heavily, and I think the fact that you don't have a high frequency transit line in Newark might have impacted that. The idea in the methodology was that because lower income folks tend to have lower rates of car ownership, that it's better for housing serving low income and very low income households to be located near services and transit and job opportunities. Yeah.
I'll speak on behalf of Newark because I think we've done an outstanding job in building housing in our community, both for moderate income and now low income residents. We recognize certainly the need in our community for that. But it seems as we go through these exercises every 8 years, it seems to be almost an intellectual exercise by identifying and planning for where housing could go. I would love to see the state come back and ask the cities to, or have the state say, how did we do in building the number of units that we were asked to build? Not only did we get certification of our plan, but how many of those units did we actually build? I would imagine that not all cities in the state of California receive certification for their plans. Would that be a true statement?
Well, so we're in a different world in the sixth cycle RENA update. In previous housing element rounds, I think that's correct. Almost every jurisdiction has gotten certification. We can learn a lot because the Bay Area is somewhat later in the housing element update cycle than Southern California jurisdictions. We can learn a lot from the San Diego region, the Central Coast region, and the Southern California regions. Of 190 housing elements that have been submitted to the state for certification, only 9 have received certification, maybe 10 or 11. It changes from day to day. A very small percentage, and HCD has provided extremely detailed comment letters to jurisdictions submitting housing elements. So the San Diego region was first, so many of the San Diego jurisdictions do now have adopted and certified housing elements. The city of San Diego, for example, has a great housing element that's available online for folks to look at. The cumulative effect of all of the new state laws that have been passed in the past 5 years in Sacramento to address the state's housing crisis is that housing element law now does have teeth, and it's not just an intellectual exercise. And HCD is looking for very robust, detailed analysis of sites to ensure that, to the extent that it's possible for cities, that they're going to be facilitating the production of housing. Now, obviously, cities and counties don't build housing directly. Developers build housing, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit developers. So what's within your control is to create the
Opportunities.
the framework, right?
Yep.
So also you're going to be required to do annual reports. You already are, but your APR, your annual progress report, will require you to show evidence that you're doing all of these things that you said you would do in the housing element. So I think the legislators in Sacramento heard this concern and have acted, and that's definitely being reflected in the way that HED is looking at draft housing elements.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Other questions? Councilmember Bucci.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Paul, thank you. I appreciate all the work you've been doing on this. I know we've been at this for a while. There was a few questions I had as far as some of the new HCD standards. One was the community engagement standard. It feels, is there guidelines for that? Because they want ongoing community engagement. What does that mean exactly?
Well, so I know it can, and this has been expressed by some of the Southern California jurisdictions that they're unclear on what the specific guidelines are and what the specific targets are. In my mind, the most important thing is that cities are doing a robust and ongoing job of reaching out to all segments of the community, that they're listening to the feedback that they're getting, and that's reflected in the policies and programs. So, what we're doing is creating a matrix of feedback and connecting that feedback to specific policies and programs, and making sure that if we've heard something, that we're showing HCD and we're showing you that we've really considered it and that we're taking it into account. That's what it means for me. It's not just a passive listening exercise of collecting the data and then sort of putting it as an appendix to the report. It's making sure that we're really paying attention to what people are telling us, and that we're reflecting that back in the document, and then we're reflecting that back to the policymakers, to the Planning Commission and the City Council in this case, so that you have the benefit of receiving that feedback when you're thinking about setting policy. So the words used by HED are frequent, ongoing,
Subjective.
continuous. But what's not subjective, so they want to see it continuous. What's not subjective, what's very clear that you just have to enumerate is, did you talk to representatives of, or advocates for the disability community? Did you talk to people, who work with those with physical or developmental disabilities? Did you talk to single parents? Did you talk to large families? Did you talk to the homeless or their advocates? Did you talk to, did you actually do outreach in multiple languages? Did you go to neighborhoods where there are larger concentrations of people of color or low-income people? Did you really go and ask all segments of the community? And if so, please show us how, and then connect the dots for us. Show us how that connects to the policies you put in place. So cities need to tell a better story, in part, than they've told in past rounds.
No, that's great. You mentioned a few new policies they had as far as staff and reporting and things like that go. We all know the answer to this, but I doubt they sent any money along with all these new standards. Correct?
Well, generally correct. There's a couple of resources. So along with this housing element update round, the state, through the regional early action program, or REAP program, has provided funding to regional councils of government and local governments for planning. So, for example, like some of the translation that we did for the community engagement survey was funded translators who ABAC provided directly to this. Nice. So the Alameda County Planning Collaborative, which is a collaborative of all of the jurisdictions in Alameda County, which provides resources and technical support to jurisdictions, is funded through the REAP program. So there are, and this is in hundreds of thousands of dollars that are being directed in each county to support local jurisdictions in doing good housing plans. So on the planning side, there is support. Now, whether or not there's sufficient resources going forward to make it possible for developers and nonprofit developers and community groups to build housing, I think that's another topic. I think there's still a big gap on the funding side in terms of making it feasible to build all of the housing that we know that we need.
It sure would be nice if they rewarded some of the jurisdictions who were meeting their RENA requirements. And,
But
you know.
Duly noted.
I saw, it was mentioned a few times throughout your report, but you never really touched on it, was ADUs. And I saw it come up. It's something we've talked a lot about. And at one point at the bottom of one of your slides, I believe it said 10 per year behind it. But that's all it said.
Yeah, well, we're gonna work on that number. Accessory dwelling units are a great way that cities can work to meet housing needs. And we think that there are lots of very creative policies and programs that you could adopt in Newark to help spur ADU production. That 10 units per year is based on an average of your ADU production over the last 3 years. And we think that it's looking at 2019, 2020, and 2021, and then averaging the number of permitted ADUs per year. That's the methodology that HCD wants us to use in order to count those towards your housing element sites. That doesn't mean you're only going to create 10 ADUs per year. You might create 100 ADUs per year. But the number that we can include in your sites inventory can only be based on the average of the last 3 years. Unless we do really like a lot of good arm wrestling with the HCD reviewer. We think you can do a lot more than 10 per year. And I think that's certainly, some of the community feedback that we got was that folks are, and even like going into when we first started the Affordable Housing Work Plan from planning commissioners and Community Development Advisory Commission members, folks mentioned ADUs as a great strategy. So that 10 per year is think of it as a placeholder for now.
Okay. Well, it's a great improvement. I'll tell you, before those 3 years, we used to turn down 10 a year for 10 years straight. We didn't approve a single one. So we're definitely headed down the right path. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And are there any comments from the Planning Commission? Yes, Commissioner Bogusich.
Turn it on? Okay. With the survey, I'm just not clear. So your company was responsible for getting the survey out to people, or? Okay, and you mentioned the Family Day in the park and the library. Aside from that, I thought Councilmember Hannon had an excellent idea if the surveys were available in different languages and distributed to all the schools and went home with the children. That would be huge, because then you would reach a lot, because I stumbled across it. I didn't even know it existed. And so that's the only reason how I found it. And also, if you want to get the vast majority of all different demographics, I think it's really important to put it in places where they go. Their local supermarkets, laundromats. Everybody that needs to wash clothes that doesn't have a washer and dryer at home goes to a laundromat. You're there for a very long time waiting for your clothes. If you have flyers up on the bulletin boards, they're going to be read. So that might be another idea for the future. And then I had, and the map showing available areas maybe for houses. I noticed you had New Park Mall, but you didn't have the area next to it. I don't know where Toys R Us used to be, and Casper's. I don't know how to describe that area, but there's a large area there that I don't think is being used to the best of its ability.
You should respond.
New Park Plaza.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Bogusich. Thank you, Commissioner Bogusich. Yes, that area is within the New Park Mall specific plan. However, it does have a land use designation that does not permit residential uses. Per the specific plan goals, the intent was to focus the residential uses on essentially inside the ring road next to the mall, and that is the plan that essentially the Planning Commission saw and the council approved late last year. The properties around the ring road and kind of the outside of that were identified as hotels and office and other commercial area, other retail areas, but not specifically for housing, because they felt they wanted the housing right in the middle next to the mall. So that's the reason why they haven't been specifically identified on these maps.
Thank you.
Other questions from the Planning Commission? Planning Commissioner Becker?
Yes, Paul, hey, great job. I really appreciate all the effort so far in this process. You know, having involved in the previous two housing element updates, you've really got your hands full, staff does too, with having to put this one together. There's a lot more requirements that are on us, and I think you're attacking them, I think, in the appropriate manner. In going through your key questions, this first one on key sites and other areas in the city, the mayor touched on the one that I had written down, the school sites. To me, that would be an obvious place to look. You had mentioned the Four Corners area had come up. Was that related to like the vacant buildings, like the old Mi Pueblo building? Was that one of them?
Yeah, yes. So we asked people where they thought housing should go, and if they didn't see it enumerated in the list that we provided, they also provided open-ended comments. And we did, just kind of by way of more background on the community engagement process, we did work with a local organization called Los Promotores, and went to supermarkets. I'm not sure about laundromats, but that's a great idea. That's an excellent outreach idea. We did reach out to the schools, libraries, a variety of other community-based organizations. Obviously, we could do more with more time, and I think we'll take those comments into consideration in the future. In terms of the Four Corners area, yeah, folks did say, what about all of those vacant lots or those closed down stores? Yeah. Right? And, you know, noticing also that a lot of our sites are on one side of the city and not on, you know, heavily concentrated in a few different areas. There were questions about, well, couldn't we make housing kind of where New Park Gardens is right now, right? There's an existing affordable senior housing development there. There's a CVS that just closed down. There's some other potential development opportunities. Yeah.
Okay, and then just moving further down this list, there are other areas in the city with environmental and infrastructure constraints. Did you identify any at this point that you did not include in there?
Yes. So there is a tool called the Housing Element Site Selection Tool, which has been created by ABAG in part through funding from the state through the REAP grant to help local jurisdictions identify sites that are really good for housing. And they have a layer within that tool that identifies sites that are have a lot of environmental constraints. And there are a few sites kind of near the bayfront, which are zoned residential, right, but that have significant environmental constraints. So I think in what's called the Area 3 and 4 specific plan area, there are some sites that could potentially be developed with residential land uses, but they have significant environmental constraints. So they didn't end up on the short list. That's an example. More in terms of environmental constraints and less in terms of infrastructure constraints. We didn't find any major infrastructure constraints that would, you know, in terms of water or sewer or other types of infrastructure that would impair residential development, but there are areas where there's environmental obstacles.
I assume there were. When I noted on your opportunity areas, you did mention the Bayside area, so I thought, well, maybe you've already looked at that, but is there something else I wasn't thinking about?
Yeah, it was more like south of the Bayside TOD area. But what we will have to, you do have to look at that layer of, are there any significant environmental constraints that would potentially prevent a developer from moving forward on a site? And if so, what are those and how do you address them?
Okay, and my final one is with the REAN allocation at 1874, isn't it really the 2249 number? Because don't you have to submit the element update with that 20% buffer?
Or a 30% buffer. Yeah, okay. There is no one number. We've used a 20% buffer here. Some jurisdictions are using a 30% buffer or even a higher buffer to just account for the fact that some of the sites that you identify for lower income housing are going to be acquired by for-profit developers and developed with, you know, not 100% affordable housing. So yeah, that's really the target. How you get to the 2249 is you have to start with the 1874 though. So I wanted to just kind of walk through that process again. And then I think maybe going forward, we can just talk about the total amount that includes the buffer.
Right. Well, it sounds like there's going to be a lot more scrutiny than there has been in the past in every step of the way in order to get this thing certified by the state. So, good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions by Planning Commission? Nope. Commissioner Fitz.
Are you turning, I'm on now? Okay, great. Paul, it's good to see you in person. I think we've been Zooming for a couple of years, right? Good. Excellent report. One thing I had a question on is that when you're identifying sites that are potentially could be used for residential, like the school sites that may or may not become vacant, you really can't include that in this report, can you? Because it's not zoned properly. As is the same situation with the Four Corners and the Orchard Supply vacant building. That may be a great site for some pretty high density there, but we can't really include that unless there's the city has to sign off on it first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, so I would be very interested in your guidance on that. You could include those sites, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask about is there, you know, is there direction, is there will to do that? It requires a few steps. You need the active participation of the property owner, or in the case, you know, the school district, to support that. And then you need a program in the housing element to be implemented within the first 3 years after adoption that would specify how the site would be rezoned. So you need, you know, you can identify those sites. So say today it's zoned commercial mixed use, right? And, you know, the commercial mixed use designation might allow housing, but not up to the densities that you want, just speculating. What are the things that you can do during the course of the first 3 years after the housing element is adopted that you could adopt as a program to make it developable with housing, right? So that it would just require us to be much more detailed in terms of the policies and programs that we would put in place to help facilitate development on those sites. So the fact that they don't have the right general plan land use designation or zoning or other things associated with the site right now doesn't mean we can't include it in the housing element. It just means that if we do include it, we need to take into account all of the different impediments and factors in order for HCD to really believe that it's going to be a viable housing element site. Yeah. And what other jurisdictions have done, the ones that have been successful in Southern California, is that they have done things like gotten, you know, letters of support from property owners, developer proposals, very detailed fact sheets about the sites, and programs and policies that get incorporated into the housing element and then adopted. And then in turn, of course, since it has to be consistent with all the other parts of the general plan, that rolls through the rest of the general plan as well.
Good. I had another question, and I'm not quite sure if it fits into this area, but it is regarding affordable housing. I do know that we have affordable housing fees that we charge for new developments and stuff like that, and it goes all into a pot. We decide where that goes. Is there a vehicle where you can take that pot of money and use it to subsidize the rents for Newark residents or Newark teachers, and take that money directly and pay it to the landlord if you got a big housing project or big apartment project? We're not buying residential things, but using it to help to subsidize, taking that money and directly putting it in the hands of basically the low-income people that we identify in Newark to help them out with their rent. Is that something that would be covered by the housing element, or that for a separate story just regarding just affordable housing in general?
Well, it's an innovative idea. The federal version of that program is, of course, the Section 8 program.
Right, that's
what
what
affordable Section 8 vouchers that they can take and present to their landlords, and they pay only 30% of their income towards their housing costs, and the rest is covered by HUD, essentially by the local housing authority. Very few local jurisdictions are in the kind of position to commit themselves to the ongoing fiscal impact of those kinds of ongoing operating or rental subsidies or other subsidies. So for the most part, particularly for things like residential impact fees, they go to fund to support development costs for new housing, right? So you would, through a NOFA or some other process, go out and attempt to find developer partners who are trying to acquire sites to develop new housing, rather than providing an ongoing source of support to individual households. It's also relatively cumbersome to administer, so it requires more staff and more capacity administratively than most cities have available to them. Do you want to?
Yeah.
I see Steven shaking his head.
No, certainly would agree with that. And actually, Commissioner Fitz, we're set up by our ordinance that there are specific uses of those affordable housing impact fees that go towards the production of affordable housing. So we are somewhat constrained by the use of those funds. However, as Paul mentioned, in fact, we are very close to releasing a notice of funding availability for an investment in affordable housing through development. That's on the council's affordable housing work plan that was adopted a year ago, and so we're very close to making that available to the public, and looking forward to receiving applications and proposals this year.
Good. I think those are the only questions I had.
Okay, then, City Clerk Harrington, does Mr. Aguilar have his hand raised by any chance?
Yes, he does, Your Honor.
Okay,
And
we'll
we will.
hear from Mr. Aguilar. Commissioner Aguilar?
Thank you, Mayor. I could see myself on the screen. That is a strange, strange view from home viewing.
I thought you were home.
Mr. Pettinger, that was a great presentation, and pretty much all of the questions I had have been answered already tonight, and so I just wanted to conclude with a comment, and you eloquently hit on this just a moment ago, but you know, when reviewing the survey, it's clear that we have a significant need for teachers, first responders, and many other workers in our community to find suitable housing within close proximity to their employers. And so with that in mind, I think it's critical now more than ever that we not only identify suitable housing opportunities, but we also implement land use policy that's conducive to incentivizing development. And that's the part that I know you just hit on, Mr. Penninger. And so as we analyze these sites, I know we looked at each of them tonight, and all of them appear to be well suited, but we did not touch on the densities. And so it's one thing to meet arena quota, but it's another to actually have those units built. So we are providing them to our community. And so no detailed feedback on each of the site, but rather just something I wanted to leave with as we go and start taking the next steps with the housing element, that we take a flexible approach so we can actually have these units built, all while respecting the surrounding neighborhoods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I believe Councilmember Bucci had a comment.
Just a quick follow-up on the path Commissioner Fitz was taking us down there. While we can't obviously help pay people's rents, could some of that money be set aside to start our first-time homebuyer program? I know some of that money was available back during redevelopment, and then when we lost that, it went away. And this wouldn't be a giveaway as much as it would be an investment that people would either pay back over time or when they sold their house. And would that be something that we could utilize some of those funds for?
Yeah, certainly the first-time home buyer program, I believe, is on the council's work plan. So it's something for us to take a look at. Whether or not we can fund that through our affordable housing impact fee funds, we'll have to investigate that. But I think with that analysis, we would look for other sources of funding that are not so constrained as a possible way to fund a first-time home buyer program. But again, that is also something that we will need to consider in terms of capacity and staffing, because those programs do take staff time and resources to properly run and manage. But no, that's certainly something that we will be looking forward to in the future.
Okay, thank you.
And we received, a significant amount of feedback from folks saying that they were very interested in first-time homebuyer programs. So, and that's obviously something that we heard from the Planning Commission and City Council, and that's in the Affordable Housing Work Plan. So that will be that will be in the housing element as a program, and we will do more due diligence and investigation on what a good funding source can be for that. One of the things that some jurisdictions are thinking about is ways that they can collaborate across jurisdictional lines, and maybe even in some cases with nonprofits to stand up affordable first-time homebuyer programs in order to manage staff costs and the ongoing costs of maintaining the portfolio. You know, doing ongoing asset management, helping homeowners, you know, if they go to resell, what their obligations are vis-a-vis the city, et cetera, et cetera. So there's different strategies that you could undertake with setting up a program.
Okay. Okay, with that, this was an informational item. No action is required. So with that, again, thank you, Mr. Penninger, for such a inclusive report. We appreciate all the work that you've done on this so far and look forward to the continuing. And with that, we are adjourned.
Me too.
Great.
We can use the